Hi, this is Paul, and I'm going to do another video on the Dodd interview. I knew this interview was going to really annoy some people because of Dodd's style. But again, I still think it was one of the better interviews, actually. And I think the reason that Dodd annoys so many people is because throughout most of the interview, he's essentially just yelling, "You're doing it wrong." Well, what do you mean you're doing it wrong? Well, and this is an instinctive, turn on my lights. This is an instinctive reaction when you get access to someone of high status who's got a #1 selling book, who's got a huge YouTube following, where we want to influence him and make him speak what's on our minds. This is completely natural to any of us, and it's, I think, part of the reason why we do this thing of sharing our thoughts with the other person, hoping to influence. Because if Brett Weinstein is right that even our little chemicals, genetic chemicals in our body have motivation, well, we certainly have motivation to propagate whatever ideas we have in our heads. And so Dodd spends most of the interview bickering with Peterson, essentially, and saying, "You're doing it wrong. You're supposed to be doing it this way. You're supposed to be doing it my way." Well, this gets into the fact that we are all theological. Now, one of the quotes that grabbed me right off the bat with this interview is Peterson says, "The battle I found myself involved in wasn't a political battle or even a psychological battle." Remember, with all his biblical lectures, he says this is a psychological interpretation. "As far as I'm concerned, it's a theological battle." So what are we doing here? Well, we're bringing order to chaos in these conversations, because this is a pretty chaotic conversation, and you kind of want to strip it down. And for me to really get a sense of a conversation like this, I need to listen to it 3 or 4 times. I need to take notes on it. I need to kind of break it down to try to see, okay, what's at the heart of this? What are our chattering writers trying to say to each other as we're sitting atop the elephant, trying to explain the elephant and look good in front of each other? Well, it's really helpful to map out the theology or worldviews of the various party, and there are many, many variables. Again, because of consciousness, I think we tend to see dualisms, because consciousness tends to be monofocal. It tends to be a monarchical vision of reality. It's my monarchical vision of reality. And because our brains are limited, especially our conscious brains, our unconscious minds run much more parallel. I'm managing my heartbeat. I'm keeping awareness of all kinds of things. The elephant is amazingly smart in some ways, but consciousness tends to be monofocal. And so dualisms are easy, because with a dualism I can say this, not that. It's very simple. Once I have 3, 4, 5 things to try to manage, most studies say we simply can't do that with our conscious mind. But most people are unaware of what they actually believe. This is part of Peterson's point and pragmatism's point about what they actually believe is often expressed in action. Most people are very unaware of what they actually believe, very unaware of the roots of their belief, the practical and philosophical implications of those beliefs, and how these beliefs impact coalitions and factions that are implicit and explicit. And in fact, all of the chattering that I'm doing, that we're doing on YouTube, this is all about managing this big, complicated world with all of these chattering writers a little bit disconnected from their elephants. The rider and the elephant, this is Jonathan Haidt's metaphor about what a human being is. Human being is the conscious mind is like the rider, the unconscious self is like the elephant. And you can read that in Jonathan Haidt's book, The Happiness Hypothesis. So again, as I mentioned in my last video, there's this worldview taxonomy that I often do. Most people, because of consciousness, one way to describe what a human being is a story. It's my material body, yes, but the story that is me begins even before birth with my parents. And even though the physical matter that make up my body is radically different than when I was conceived or born or 5 years old or 25 years old, what holds me together as a person is a story. Okay? And so there are certain aspects of a story that make sense of the story. And then all of us together make these larger stories. So where do we come from? Who or what are we? What is the nature of our problem? Because if you look, again, at any good story, if you have a story without a problem, you don't have a story. And if you have a movie without a problem, you very quickly lose interest in it. I watched the Jonathan Pajot conversation with, is it Verkijk, from another professor at University of Toronto, when they talked about interest and psychology. And I thought that was very, very helpful, because often people ask me for book recommendations, and to just give book recommendations abstractly, I don't think works very well. I think I want to know what you're interested in now, and I might find a book that you're interested in and give that, or give you the title of that, because that's probably what you'll read, because again, you're interested in it. So where are we from? What are we? Who are we? What's the nature of our problem? What is the hope for resolution of our problem? And what is our telos, our destination, our eschatology? And as I mentioned before, these map pretty well onto the loci of systematic theology and Christianity. Prolegomena, how do we know the truth? Theology, who or what is God? Anthropology, who or what are we? Soteriology, how are we saved? And eschatology, what is the final outcome? And there's a deep relationship between the loci, which was an attempt by theologians to map a framework over the Bible. Later on in biblical studies, you have what's called biblical theology, where we kind of pull back from the loci and we try to look at, well, what is the story of the Bible? And I've talked quite a bit about that. But systematic theology comes at the Bible with our questions and says, how can we use the Bible to answer our questions? Now, Dodd pursues Peterson and challenges him better than most, I think, in this video. And that's really hard to see, because it is kind of a dogfight through this whole video, because Dodd just keeps on him. And not all of Dodd's points or critiques are good, but what Dodd manages to do throughout the chaos of this video is bring up some of the critiques that are coming to Peterson that I think are some of the better critiques of Peterson. And I think I'll probably talk about some of these critiques in some upcoming videos, because no one is perfect. And so, and Peterson in his more humble moments does a good job of saying, correct me, show me that I'm wrong. And if any of us want to learn, one of the hardest things we have to learn is to be open to correction, to listen to our critics, even listen to our enemies, and see what we can learn from them. And with all the hit pieces coming out now, if you're patient and listen, we can learn some critiques from them, and in the end, know better, know more, know truer, be stronger. That's what enemies can do for you. Now, some of the critiques of Peterson that are arising, and I'm just going to kind of put these in Dodd's words, although these aren't necessarily direct quotes. You say you want to reduce polarization, but you yourself have now become a polarizing figure. This is a criticism we're hearing more and more against Peterson, and I think there's validity to it. Peterson has become a polarized figure. Now, we might say that he's only become a polarized figure because he's getting attacked, and he's getting attacked unfairly, yada, yada, yada. To a certain degree, the outcome is the outcome. And this is part of what's happened to the Peterson moment. You critique activism, but in a way, your effort is activistic. Again, Dodd doesn't say this directly, but this is behind a lot of the criticism that Dodd and others are putting at him. You don't like these activists, but you're, in a sense, out there being an activist too. You're being a counter-revolutionary. You're being a counter-activist. You've entered the hearts and mind to read dramatically and successfully. And this is some of Michael Eric Dyson's complaint. Oh, Jordan Peterson, you're going to complain to me? You have a $1 million subscribers on YouTube. You have a #1 selling book, and you're making complaints. You're about as visible and as out there as anyone, and your name is regularly being promoted in newspapers. Even negative press, in a sense, is attention, and your following continues to grow. So, in a sense, you're in the game too. Even if you're an anti-revolutionary or a counter-revolutionary, you still are in the drama. Dodd really gets on him for set your house in perfect order before you try to fix the world. Are you talking to 18-year-olds? Who are you talking to? And would Martin Luther King Jr., for example, reach such a standard? Again, this is, I remember when I first read the rule, I thought, perfect? Who of us? I think the rule would have been better, set your house in order before. And Dodd's point that, people are out there and 18-year-olds can do stuff. And Peterson's point that, and I know 18-year-olds and young people, when I say things like this to my kids, they get reactive pretty quick, and it's perhaps an unfair thing for an older person to say because we have the benefit of being older and they do not. I see the world differently than I did when I was 18. Now, what's to say that I see the world more clearly than I did when I was 18? I suspect I do, but is that simply a bias of age? These are all fair questions. Are you simply trying to resist liberationist progress by denying past injustices? This is a big question, and we're going to deal with this a little bit later in this video. And then the Chaos Feminine Association is getting pinged right now. Rachel Fulton Brown connected with me a number of months ago, and we had some offline chat. And the association between chaos and the feminine, this comes up in the Quick to Listen podcast. This comes up in this podcast. Now, Peterson's point, I think, and this is common of a lot of what Peterson does, and I think it's common for all of us. I make points based on my reading, understanding, training, tradition of the Bible, and I use the language of that tradition. When those points are heard outside of my context, they're seen with different filters. So when Peterson, another thing that got brought up in the Quick to Listen podcast by Galley, who again I think has been following Peterson well and quite closely, he's the editor of Christianity Today. Actually, it'd be a very interesting conversation between Peterson and Galley. It'd be nice if Galley could line up that interview. He probably has sufficiently high status to get an interview with Peterson. But Galley's point is that in some ways, theologically, chaos for Peterson means two different things. On one hand, order and chaos is this yin and yang. This is, in a sense, the neutral sense of chaos, which is in, so the tohu wavohu at the beginning of Genesis 1, that's kind of a morally neutral sense of chaos. It's non-functioning, but it's not necessarily evil. Sometimes for Peterson, chaos means evil. And now this distinction and this conflict isn't new to Peterson. It's there in the Old Testament. Sometimes chaos can be evil, but here's the thing. Sometimes order can be evil. And we've talked about that too. So there's a sense in some ways that chaos is morally neutral, and there's a sense in some ways that chaos can be morally evil. And when Peterson associates this with the feminine, well, let's give Peterson the benefit of the doubt that he's using the morally neutral, and he's talking about this in terms of archetypes and frameworks that are long established, as Peterson says. But it's very interesting. It's very easy for women, because we all tend to be a little bit reactive and defensive, it's very easy for that chaos evil to be associated with the feminine. And then with all of the slapping of the word patriarchy on him, women are hearing this and they're reacting to it. Now it's important to remember that most of us, as I said initially in this video, most of us are pretty reactive. We work on low resolution. We never have a second chance to have a first impression. We very quickly, and this is in a sense the political game that's being played out in the media right now with the negative war against Peterson. I read an article on Pathos yesterday. It was just didn't make an argument, was just slapping labels on Peterson. He's a racist, he's a bigot, blah, 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 blah. This game isn't without its effect, because never heard of Jordan Peterson, someone you like and trust calls him this, that's your bias. That's the bias you go into the conversation with. And once that bias is set, it takes a fair amount of dissonance to overcome that bias. In a sense, that's kind of a micro conversion. In a sense, that's what Peterson says in terms of a tiny little death that goes on. Every time we change our mind about something, one idea has to die, one bias has to die in order for another bias or idea to live. And so this game of first impressions, this use of the media to plaster Peterson with a reputation, that's what this game is about. And the chaos feminine issue is low-hanging fruit in that game that you can use to attack him. So he's bickering with Dodd, and Dodd just keeps saying, you're not doing it right, you're not doing it right. And what Dodd means is that you're not doing it like I would do it. If I had your status, if I had a #1 selling book, if I had 1 million subscribers on YouTube, I would be saying this. Now, part of what Peterson probably should have said early on, one way to kind of defuse this game is to face that dynamic right away. Dodd probably would have defensively retreated back into the interviewer mode and say, no, I'm just trying to get your ideas out. Okay, fair enough. Use your platform to get your ideas out. Use my platform to get my ideas out. As a human being, I have the right to express myself, and I have the right to have choices. There are people out there fighting all kinds of battles on all kinds of fronts. Maybe you're really concerned about concussions in the NFL. Well, there's your battle. Go ahead and fight your battle. Maybe you're really concerned about groundhogs, and the prairie dogs of South Dakota are endangered because of farming. Go fight your battle against the farmers. Go fight your battle for the wolves. Go fight your battle for, there's a whole bunch of people, including Andrew Sullivan, whose writing I often appreciate. Fight your foreskin battle. The circumcision is male genital mutilation, blah, 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 blah. There's a world full of battles. And in so a sense, this argument, you're doing it wrong, it's a little bit of a weak argument, but the argument is a function of personhood and consciousness. We all see the world as we see it, and we want to set the world to rights according to our perspectives, and so we tend to fight these battles. So your emphasis is on the wrong thing. You're playing around with these SJWs. Obviously, Dodd doesn't think the SJWs are a big deal. Peterson does. Universities aren't really turning out activists, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. There are more important issues to address. Okay, Dodd, you're addressing the important issues. You have a radio show. You have influence. You worked in China, so on and so forth. So have at it. But why criticize Peterson for the things he sees? Well, at the same time, this is part of the influence game. We try to awaken another to our perspective, and we try to convert another to our perspective. Well, let's talk about the universities a little bit. Are they really turning out activists? And I think this is a fair point from Dodd. Now, I think what universities are actually doing is religious indoctrination more than activism. And what you'll find is the zealous edge of the spectrum will tend to get activated. But if you look at even places like UC Berkeley, you look at what's going on in these campuses. Many of the students are there because they want to get an education and they don't want to be bothered. And the more annoying many of these activists get, and this was brought out in the Monk debate, and this brought out by Stephen Fry, you seem to be turning more and more people to the other side. The poorer you behave, the more you convince the other side that they're right, because your poor behavior is justification for their, what you call, indifference. So most students want to keep their heads down, get their degree, get their job, make their money, have the life they've always wanted. And this is my argument that this is really about religion, but it's both sides of materialism. One side is the philosophical materialism that we've talked about quite a bit, but the other side is the lifestyle materialism. And to a degree, does a materialist philosophy yield greed? And if you remember back in the 80s, greed is good. Does a materialist philosophy yield or eventually deliver a materialist perspective? Because finally, all that matters is money and getting stuff and so on and so forth. And this is underneath all of this. Now let's resist some facile dualisms, because right now what we've got going on in our culture, in terms of our culture war and political, is there's a lot more complexity than just two sides, even though the American political system wants to reduce everything down to Democrats and Republicans. You have the establishment right that tend to be economic elites. And I remember an interview with Caitlyn Jenner where she says, I'm a Republican because I have all this money. Greed is good. You have the establishment left. You have the elites of the left. You have Hillary Clinton calling them a basket of deplorables. You have Barack Obama saying they're clinging to their religion and guns. I mean, these two quotations get remembered because they go right to the heart of the ideological and political differences, and especially the social elitism. So you have limousine liberals, and as David Brooks and Charles Murray in some of their books have both pointed out, they live like Puritans, but they preach like libertines. It's the wealthy and the powerful that stay together. Why? For the money. And they stay married, and they live like Puritans, but they preach like libertines. And someone might argue, well, that's a pretty smart way to keep the competition at bay if everyone else is living in chaos and your wealthy, liberal, elitist self get to live in disciplined affluence, and you have affluence because of your discipline. Well, it works. You just keep eliminating the competition because they keep falling prey to drugs and alcohol and marital chaos and family disorder and so on and so forth. And there's a vivid debate in terms of how economic plays in that. And it's certainly a strong argument that I think in the future we're increasingly going to see two groups of people actually being able to maintain marriage. And those will be the wealthy and the religious. Why? Because if you have enough self-discipline to get wealthy, well, then you have enough self-discipline. It might be inherent, it might be biological, it might be due to your upbringing or your personality. Religion is its own kind of discipline. And as we've seen in generations in Latin America, they often talk about the evangelical lift, where suddenly if someone converts, Christianity is a little bit different in Latin America than it is in North America. There's nominal Catholicism is widespread and pervasive. I'm not talking about committed Catholics. I'm talking about nominal Catholics. Generally speaking, if a family converts and the man stops drinking and he stops wasting his money chasing women, so on and so forth, and then starts devoting his money to the family and starts staying faithful to his wife, as your evangelical church is going to preach, and starts educating his children, that second generation is going to see an economic bump. And this is, you can Google this, the evangelical bump in Latin America. It's quite well attested, and it makes perfect sense, because when we ran in the Dominican Republic, when we ran income generation projects, we almost always ran it with women, because generally speaking, if a woman had money in her pocket, the children would eat. If a non-Christian man had money in his pocket, that money just usually went to feed his appetites. But right now in the States, you have the establishment right, you have the establishment left, and now you have populism, and you've got both the right and the left wings of that with Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And so perhaps what you see with the intellectual dark web is that some of this is really about populism. And if you look at these individuals that are always named in the intellectual dark web, they are by no means low status people, and they are by no means unsuccessful people, and they are by no means, many cases, not wealthy people, or at least solidly middle class, but they are in some sense working populist media. So there are a lot of layers to this. What universities are doing is religious indoctrination. Now, most religious students will be social justice warriors if they're the zealots. I've just been reading N.T. Wright's new biography of the Apostle Paul and enjoying it. It's a good book. Recommend it. but students that really get religion in university, and I don't mean traditional religions, I mean the religion of the university, they're the ones that become social justice warriors. They will deny materialism lifestyle, because if you're really going to be the deeply committed comrade to the revolution, well, you're going to live a stark, austere life when it comes to money. Maybe. See, that's part of where the 1960s radicals and the 2018 radicals differ. This we're going to talk about different brands of Marxism a little bit later, but the austerity of the revolution of the 60s kind of got wrung out of them by the affluence of the baby boomers. And so basically the brand of Marxism that we see promoted in the university is both an economic elite and a supposed Marxist. You think you can have heaven and earth. You think you can have your cake and eat it too. So this is one of the difference of the new religion of the university. They deny lifestyle. They will deny lifestyle materialism, maybe, but they haven't burned out yet on sexual hedonism. And there's definitely a telos at work here, and it's a utopianism within this frame. And again, see, as I talked about in my last video, Charles Taylor's immanent frame. A really great example of this was picked up by a story in the New York Post about this woman who was a dating columnist, and she lived the life of Sex in the City, and she basically says, you know, it ruined my life, and all this sex and attention and media and glamour, it was all unfulfilling. Well, what is going to be fulfilling for her then? Well, it's interesting but it came too late. In my heart, I was finished trying to be Carrie. When the show wasn't renewed for a second season, I was relieved. The experience made me really look at myself. I was trying so hard to be liked that it was coming across as inauthentic and bitchy. Inauthentic is a very important word in the immanent frame, because authenticity and the sacred secret self is a deep part of the new religion. Also, it was miserable to have cameras around all the time. We all want to be famous until we're famous, and then we want our privacy. Now, if you're not famous, you have a world full of privacy, and you want fame. This is very telling about human nature and how we are. Back to reading. Finally, I cut my ties to New York and moved to San Francisco. A more woke city. Full-time in 2013. I tried being a tech columnist and writing a personal growth book called Experiments in Happiness. Well, you know, she wants to write a self-help book too. Self-help books sell very well. Finally, I decided to go private for a while. I stopped blogging and writing, and I rarely posted on Instagram. These days, I work as a change activist. Well, what's going on here? This is the new religion. A change activist, mounting summits for world leaders and serving as advisor to startups and entrepreneurs looking to better the planet. This is the new religion, right? I'm finally living a life of integrity. I'm attuned to my values. I'm attuned to my values. I never heard about values and Sex in the City. A better hedonism. But doesn't mean she's going to be a monk. Again, this is one-speed religion. I dated a woman for a while. This is part of the wokeness. A beautiful entrepreneur who was also jilted by New York. That's definitely not something you saw Carrie do, but dating is not front and center in my life anymore. Oh. Although it was all I talked about in my 20s. That's pretty one-dimensional. Now she's woke. She's well-rounded. She's an activist. She's Miss Jenner throwing off the wig, ready to join the Pepsi parade. Last year, I ended a 2-year relationship with a man. See, she's transcended her biology. I ended a 2-year relationship with a man who ultimately couldn't commit and wanted to be polyamorous. Oh, come on, that's a limit to her wokeness. A truly open person has no boundaries. But this is part of the battle that she's fighting. What boundaries? Again, Sex in the City, and the lessons it taught me was the culprit. The show wasn't a rubric on how to find a lifelong partner. I don't know that your current life is either. I was more grounded and had honestly assessed whether this man was a good partner for me, I don't think we ever would have dated. That's interesting. So you wouldn't have dated, but he became a partner. In other words, well, what is the theology? What is the current ascendant theology, ascendant morality of our country? It is transcending all limitations. It is what I call progressive liberationism. And in fact, within her life, she is living out in a microcosm progressive liberation. Well, she tried just mere sexual libertinism, and she had economic success at the same time. She doesn't sound like she's hurting for money at all. And well, that didn't fulfill her. So now she's an activist. So she's trying to make the world a better place. She's out there for the common good. Now, whenever you look at these words, you always have to pause and say, well, can we get specific about this common good? Well, it's just the common good. Well, can we get specific about which elements of the common good? You see, the problem is when you start getting specific, you start getting into trade-offs. And, well, there are always trade-offs. And when you start getting into trade-offs, then you start getting into conflict, because some people will choose this trade and some people will choose that trade, and then you're going to be in conflict. So where do you go? But this is the new religion of the university. Now, Dodd is right to push back on a lot of Peterson stuff. Peterson is fighting a theological battle. It is not so much activism, but religion. Neither Dodd nor Peterson seem to be terribly in tune with the religious contours of what they're dealing with. Now, I think Peterson is quite a bit more than Dodd. Dodd seems, frankly, a little naive out of his 60-some years. Well, of course, I've got a different perspective because I'm a different person. Now I'm bickering with Dodd. So I want to talk a little bit about the enduring influence of Marx, because this very much comes in. And there's a section in the video when Peterson says, and this is the section, I did a little cruising on Reddit to see what kind of chatter there was about this video, and it's the brass tacks comment. It's right there when Dodd engages his Marxism with Peterson's critique of Marxism, and it has everything to do with complaining about capitalism. Dodd gives a little bit of biographical information in this, and he's a retired literature professor. He grew up in a mining village in England someplace. He's devastated by technological dislocation. Coal, dirty coal. This again, the Trumpism narratives are in here because Trump immediately jumped to support the coal miners. Now, as many people have noted, coal mining is a smaller industry than solar, and if you actually want to look for a future industry, maybe it's solar. I don't know. I'm not an economist. I'm not an engineer. But coal is symbolically powerful. Well, what's it symbolically powerful of? It's symbolically powerful of economic dislocation, by technology and globalization. And I've shared some of what I think about Trump. I didn't vote for the man. I certainly won't vote for him in 2020. He certainly doesn't seem to have a good grasp on his own. Someone on Twitter said Scott Adams and I should have a conversation. Scott, I'll talk to you whenever you want to. I don't think Scott Adams will be calling me. He's way too high status. But there's a certain amount of genius in terms of Trump's animality, in that Trump instinctively saw the symbolism of the coal miners. And the coal miner business with Trump was not about all the literalism that the liberal critique had of Trump. It was about the same symbolism as, in a sense, the steel trade war that Trump is getting into now. Well, what's all this about? This is about the midterms. Now, people are complaining in industry that, this is going to hurt the economy, and it very well might. I think both the Republicans and the Democrats have a point that this is a bad idea. But symbolically, politically, this isn't dumb, because what Trump is doing is reinforcing a narrative of dislocation. But see, Dodd sees this in a different way. They see the same thing and they turn it around, and Dodd critiques capitalism by this, because he says, well, there was mining went away and then drugs moved in and people self-medicated their despair. And in a few places in this interview, Dodd says capitalism is destroying the family and the economic basis for family life. And one of the things you see throughout this interview is Dodd almost sounds like Jim Dobson, focus on the family. We need to look out for the family. So is Dodd that far away from Republicans? Is he a traditionalist? Dodd has a lot of traditionalism in him. He's saying we have to save the family. But Dodd's theory about saving the family is a very different method. So Dodd says capitalism is the enemy. Well, if capitalism is the enemy, who is going to be the big gorilla to critique capitalism? Well, Dodd's still living in the 20th century. It's Marxism. We need Marxism to correct capitalism. And in fact, listening to students coming out of the university, when I ask them about Marxism and the Soviet Union, they all say the same thing. They all say, well, that wasn't really Marxism. Well, what Marxism do you mean? Well, the anti-capitalist Marxism. Well, their idea about Marxism is about this deep, because about all they know about Marxism is that it's the opposite of capitalism. And they look around at capitalism and they see that there are winners and losers and the market doesn't care, and they say, oh, we need something better, we see Marxism. But what do they really mean by Marxism? What they really mean is Marxism light, which is socialism, and they're looking at the kind of state socialism that you have in Western democracies. In Canada, to a degree, more than the United States. In England, more than Canada. And in Scandinavia, more than in England. This is the religious system that is being promoted in the universities. And this gets played out in low resolution in the American partisan political debate, that the president can tweet all kinds of inanity. He can do things that are politically probably self-destructive, like not welcome the Philadelphia Eagles to the White House, so on and so forth. He can do all of this, but why do they keep winning? Because there's a far bigger battle, which is quite religious. And at this point, so far, the economic elites of the Republicans have managed to outplay some of the economics and limousine liberals of the Democrats, but it's a really tight race every time. And in fact, one might argue that the more competence both political parties have, because you have a two-party system, they're, the competition is so binary, they're going to stay equal. And you're not very often going to see one overcoming the other so dramatically. And for all of Trump's vibrato about his big victory, this was, again, an electoral college victory, which is still a victory, but a popular defeat. And what Trump has basically decided to do politically is think that he can outlast this by continuing to appeal to his base and not try to make the same kind of overtures to the other side that, for example, you saw in Barack Obama's 2008 acceptance address. That has been political boilerplate. What Obama has done and what Trump has done has been very different. But many see Marxism simply as a critique of the brutal marketplace that can be employed with Marxism light socialism, like you're seeing in the Western democracies, where the state eases those transitions. And that's where you have a vibrant social safety net. But this gets then into the much broader political arguments, whether such a thing is sustainable or is it healthy. I'll have people from the right say things like, you don't see a diseased elk because the wolf gets them. Well, that's only if you leave the wolves in the environment, and it's usually the Republican voting ranchers that want to keep the environmentalists from reintroducing the wolves to Yellowstone, and so on and so forth. And so this is the American game, political game, and this is how this thing gets played out. But which Marxism? Dodd and many others in the West want to have Marxism light. Which, is it Marxism? Well, we're going to have to talk a little bit about Marxism. But basically, it's European socialism. And remember, Peterson is a Canadian. And I will often have people come to me and say, well, how can you be talking about this Jordan Peterson? He's a bigot and he's misogynist and blah, 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 blah. And I say, no, wait a minute. This is a university professor from University of Toronto. And despite Bernie Schiff's letter about him in the Toronto Star, he didn't really have any trouble for most of his career there. Some of Peterson's personal friends have sent me information and sent me some links and stuff, basically saying, politically, he's moderate left Canadian. Well, where does that put him on the map of American politics? He's hardly a right winger when it comes to his own politics, which makes the reputational assassination that's going on about him just simply ludicrous factually. But again, that game is not about facts, it's about politics. So Peterson himself is well embedded within socialism in Canada, at least Canadian brand of socialism, which is probably a tick between English socialism and American, the degree that America has socialism, and we could debate that plenty. For Peterson, Marxism is a subset of collectivism, which also includes the Nazis on the right. Now, this is important when you listen to Peterson, because there are a lot of videos out there critiquing Peterson's view of postmodernism, his views of Marxism, his view of Nazism. And Peterson is pretty low resolution on these things. Not completely low resolution that just says Nazi bad, but we've got Nazis and Marxists, they're collectivist. And so this is the resistance to the identity politics game that Peterson is playing. So people are reduced to their class in Marx, and people are reduced to their race in the Nazi ideology, and then history becomes a struggle of collectives. And this is why Peterson continues to talk about, when you go back and you look at history as this is a story about men oppressing women until we woke in the 1960s, and then Dodd basically says, oh, that's a Punch and Judy representation. Yeah, it is, but it's also the dominant one. So is Dodd right that it's a Punch and Judy representation? Yeah. But he's making Peterson's point, because Peterson's point is this is what people are, this is the low resolution thing that people are leaving the university with. And that makes perfect sense then of Peterson, because he comes in and says, I want to up your resolution on men and women. And again, look at Brett Weinstein. Weinstein in his Joe Rogan interview says quite persuasively, the real thing that you're going to have to look at is race, because it's easier to pair off and do genocide racially than it is to do sexually, because men and women need each other, at least until we get to a Brave New World and biologically we uncouple completely sex from procreation. We're not there yet, but we're pretty close. Now, Jordan Peterson's postmodern neo-Marxism is itself a fairly low resolution public persuasion piece, okay? And he lays this out in a number of places, especially the Wisconsin lecture that he gave, which was one of his angrier lectures. And postmodernity's skepticism about text and narrative means nothing, means nothing, man, right? Sometimes I write these PowerPoints and it's like, they make no sense when I look at them the next day. What was I thinking? Basically, postmodernity's skepticism of texts and narratives mean nothing may reign, but it fails to recognize itself as a reigning narrative. Neo-Marxism sneaks a narrative of oppressed and oppressor under the door. And this unites the progressive liberationist, focusing on Dodd's black, marginalized, and excluded. Now, is this fair to postmodernity or Marxism? Not completely. What is it? It is, in a sense, Peterson himself has taken a fairly low resolution, weaponized, as pastors would say, preachable point and used it. And in fact, it is preachable. Now, again, if you look at it very, very closely, there are going to be issues that arise. But does this describe historical postmodernity or historical Marxism? Maybe not perfectly, but we're not really talking about the embodiments in the 60s or 30s about these. We're talking about this low resolution things that are running around in people's minds. Because what's in Dodd's mind is what's in the public's mind. Capitalism bad, maybe Marxism to stop capitalism. I don't even know what Marxism means, but if it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But there's just a lot of fuzzy thinking in this whole thing, because as we've seen before also, you've got Yale University students complaining about the privilege of other Yale University students, and you begin to say, you're all privileged, which again is exactly what Peterson is saying. And if you look at the global perspective, if you're living a middle-class lifestyle in North America, you're all privileged. Well, what are you suffering from? Well, first world problems. And this then gets into the question of suffering. That suffering, although economic deprivation can cause suffering, Leona Helmsley, suffered over her little dog to which she left her fortune to. Suffering scales, and in some ways knows no class. Oh, the Vanderbilts up the road have a bigger yacht than I have. It's tormenting me day and night. So you pay your therapist thousands of dollars to sit in a room and hear you whine about it, or you pay your pastor. But pastors are, we believe much more in therapists than we believe in pastors. That's just where the conversation is. Dodd brings up collectivism and Christianity, and he makes a good point. And I talked quite a bit about Jordan Peterson's Protestantism, and in a sense, Peterson is a Protestant the way Matt Dillahunty is a Christian, because this gets into individualism and Protestantism are far closer together, and it gets in there. Martin Luther comes up with the invisible church. And now going back to my Jordan Peterson and the History of God videos, one of the Bible's major themes is God versus the empires. And that's very strong throughout the Old Testament prophets, and especially in the book of Revelation, the Whore of Babylon, all of these things. All ancient empires were theocratic. Most gods just wanted their sacrifices and offerings, but Israel's God wanted covenant obedience, which meant all of life. So now you have the basis of one-speed religion right there in the Old Testament prophets. And so the competition between two-speed religion and one-speed religion that I talked about in my previous video gets into, some of the relationships between Catholicism and Protestantism. But what happens, as I talked about in my Jordan Peterson and the History of God video, the state becomes the vehicle for the kingdom of heaven. And that's what we're seeing. And so what we see in Marx is that, again, the state becomes the vehicle for the Marxist utopian that comes online in Marxist thought. Now, Peterson is a man of low expectations. And now, a year of studying him, I think after all of this study and all of this talk and all of this time, I think I'm getting, in a sense, to the point of kind of getting to the bottom of him, at least the bottom of him where he's at today, and trying and getting to the bottom of his religious perspective. So he has lower expectations. He's happy the lights are on and that things are a lot better for folks. And when people complain that you want to turn the clock back to Jim Crow America, he's like, no, I don't. Canada didn't have slavery. Peterson's a Western libertarian-ish Canadian in some ways, but he's not going to not take his Ontario socialized medicine, and he's not going to, that's probably Freddie, he's not going to, he's not trading this in. In a sense, he says life is pretty good now, and what the new revolutionaries are in danger of is losing it. At heart, that's Peterson's message. And he says life is suffering. And to the end of the Dodd video, it's very, very clear, because Dodd keeps banging on about you're not doing it right. And Peterson says, yes, I am, because I'm a clinical psychologist. And you'll notice almost every time you push Peterson into a corner and really, get him to explain who he is deep down at bottom, that's what he'll come up with. I'm a clinical psychologist. I sit down with hurting people and I just want to make their life better. And I think that is exactly at the heart of his mission. And that is exactly behind his books. And that is exactly why he breaks down into tears. In a sense, what Peterson is a psychologist that's found a bigger platform to try to help people broader than one-on-one in the room. And just as there was an article over the last weekend that talked about the Canadian, it talked about Peterson, kind of the destruction of his practice because of his newfound fame, well, he's doing on a larger stage what he's always done on a smaller stage. And friends of mine who know that I'm making videos but not watching them because it's YouTubers that watch these things, see these videos as exactly what I'm doing. I'm doing in these videos what I've always done. Peterson is a clinical psychologist. Life is suffering. That's at the heart of his religion. Life is suffering. So there's a little bit of Buddhism in there too. And life is suffering, and I want to make life better. But, as again the Quick to Listen podcast noted, is there eschatology in there? That's a really good question. Peterson is anti-utopian, while the Marxist statism is utopian, and so Peterson is an anti-revolutionary and in some senses a counter-revolutionary, and he's trying to fight the utopianism that he believes will bring the kind of bloodshed that we saw in Nazi and in the communist and Nazi regimes. And he's saying that this bloodshed is a function, one of the steps to this disastrous utopian vision is collectivism. So Peterson simply has lower expectations. Now, does Peterson get his totalitarians right? Someone sent me in the comment section. I actually do look at the videos you send me in the comment section. I can't comment as much anymore because there's a lot of comments and a lot of emails and such. But, you know, Jordan Peterson doesn't understand Nazism. And that video made some very fair points. Before any of this Jordan Peterson stuff got going, I read Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, which is an amazing book, but a depressing book. And again, I've given this warning before with this book. If you're prone to depression, don't read it, because according to Jonathan Haidt, I'm one of these winners of the cortical lottery. I'm a pretty happy guy and pretty stable. But boy, that book was rough, because the kinds of things that Stalin and Hitler did to Poland and Ukraine and Belarus and this land between them was just horrible. And these poor people couldn't win. First they had Stalin breathing down their necks, and then they had Hitler, and then they had Stalin again. And just awful, awful, awful. Last Sunday I had a story in 2 Kings in the siege of Samaria where women are eating their babies, and someone says, yeah, that's why I don't like the Bible. Well, if you don't like the Bible, you're not going to want Stalin's Russia, because there's plenty of cannibalism going on there. Does Peterson get his totalitarians right? Again, yes and no. Peterson is preaching a low-resolution view of this for a popular audience in order to forestall what Peterson sees as the possibility of losing the good life that we have. And so Peterson, in that sense, is a man of low expectations. Now, I think Peterson's low resolution, you can up the resolution, and I don't know what Peterson does and doesn't know. But my reading of this says, Nazism is a history of the story of racial struggle and triumph. That's what they believed the real struggle was. Now, Hegel is behind this, and Hegel is behind Marx as well. That you've got synthesis, antithesis, or you've got thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. And so what tends to happen is that this framework of imagining history, this progressivism, gets going. And so Nazis believe that history is the struggle of races. And this makes sense of what seemed a pragmatic disaster, which was, why would the Nazis be expending energy on the destruction of the Jews? Now, they made considerable money looting the Jews, but they didn't just loot the Jews. They destroyed Slavs and many other groups. Well, why did they do this? Well, it fit in with their plan. Hitler believed he was catalyzing progress. Well, Stalin, the same thing. Why do the counterintuitive thing of removing the kulaks and destroying the farming system of the Ukraine that the Soviet Union is in desperate need of, instead of doing something sustainable, more sustainable, like Calvinism, Capitalism, and there's a relationship between capitalism and Calvinism. I'm not going there, but capitalism, why would Stalin do something so counterproductive, which was also immense suffering? Well, it was because, as Peterson says, it was ideological possession. He believed in his narrative so much that he did stupid things with it. And eventually the West wins. Now, again, Harari, in his books, talks about basically three humanisms, and the humanism of the West finally won out in World War II over the Nazis and in the Cold War over Russia. But the progressivism continues to be in there. And now I want to be fair here, in that in many ways this linear progressive view of history owes itself to Christianity. And Jonathan's brother, I can't say his name, Matthew, to anglicize it, makes the point that the point about linear versus circular history, and that's a very interesting conversation. But Christianity has very much a progressive view of history. Islam has a progressive view of history. Mormons have a progressive view of history. This progressivism gets tied into other schemes of what kinds of progress. Well, Marxism was a materialist progressivism. Nazism was a racial progressivism. Well, what do we have right now? I'd say, in a sense, we have the cult of technological and social progressivism. And, even if you look at, let's say, Brett Weinstein's comment in the Rebel Wisdom clip that I played a little while ago, where he says, well, we've got this animal where we are assassin robots who have grown a morality, but morality is against our programming, and I talked about that a few videos ago. This is, in a sense, what we're dealing with. And so, well, how I would argue that Christianity in some ways balances the utopianism, and I talked about this in my previous video, because of the belief in an afterlife. And that's what helps keep, not always, because it's gone off the rails many times, but tries to help keep the progressivism from slipping into utopianism. Because, again, if you look at Calvinism, unlike certain traditions, I don't want to get into a whole bunch of Protestant intramural bickering, but some of the holiness movements and the perfectionist movements, many of which really arose to prominence at the end of the 19th century, in the midst of all of these other social movements that were coming on, you'll often recognize that theological fashion often follows social fashion. So all of this progressivism is moving together. So does Jordan Peterson get postmodernity right? And in this video, the person makes the point that Marxism differs dramatically in postmodernity, but the point isn't that Peterson understands the literature on both of these, whether he does or doesn't. I'm not going to be the judge. As the author of this video says, he's certainly smart enough to. But the point is, in Jordan Peterson's preaching here, he is making the point that in the low resolution mind of many people, these things have merged. And this is what's coming out in the stew. And this is how regular people do theology and philosophy. People concoct their worldviews from a buffet of options. The chattering writers pick up ideas that make post hoc sense of what the elephant wants to do. That's Jonathan Haidt. It's usually only education, rationality, training, and community that the ways of the elephant change. So as Jonathan Haidt says, if you want to change the behavior of the elephant, you have to change the path. And that usually means, well, how do elephants create paths? Elephants create paths in herds. Well, how do we herd? Well, we're going to have to herd in a sustainable way. And this is, in a sense, where we come all the way back to Peterson and his religious perspective, that Peterson is saying what we find in religion are the paths of elephants that have succeeded. And to the degree that we're going to be revolutionaries and we blaze our own trails, we're probably blazing trails into extinction. In a nutshell, that's Jordan Peterson, okay? After a year of listening to him and 6 months of talking about him, I think I'm finally getting him into a nutshell. That's essentially his argument. His argument is this: like Jonathan Haidt, we're elephants and riders. Why look at religion? Religion is the trails that our ancients have created, and those trails are validated by evolution and by fairy tales. And this is where Jung comes in, but it's not just Jung. All of this comes together and say we have reliable paths. We should stick to the paths. Don't become revolutionaries trying to blaze new trails, because you're going to muck it up and you're probably going to die. Most revolutionaries die. We don't want to be a revolutionary society. We don't want to be on the bleeding edge. Well, and now you might argue, isn't this what befalls most empires? They get full of themselves and they run off the path. Well, maybe this is what we're doing. And this is in a sense why Peterson, who is politically a Canadian moderate, is in some sense a conservative. And that's why the conservatives are all hearing this, because this is deep within conservatism. And I think Peterson is right. There's always a balance. I myself am a political moderate, and I want to listen to the conservatives, and I want to listen to the liberals, and I want to listen to both sides. And I'll say, okay, I'm going to listen to both sides, and I'm going to try and use my noodle and weigh them, and then say, all right, well, first do no harm, but maybe we can improve things. Let's try a little bit of this and see what happens. So Peterson on postmodern Marxism. I don't know what Peterson knows or doesn't know. Sometimes this is basically what I said in the last slide. His diagnosis seems accurate. People mix in their worldview buffets. You've got some postmodern skepticism. You've got some low resolution abstraction of oppressed and oppressor, rather than bourgeoisie is so hard to spell, and our universities just aren't what they used to be. Bourgeois and proletariat? Boy, that's a whole new language. Why not oppressed and oppressors? And why not take racial minority conflicts and women, and especially when the felt morality I have inherited is an image I captured from the civil rights movement. I've only seen 4 or 5 minutes clipped from Dr. King's speeches. I see his statue in Washington, D.C. Nobody speaks ill of the man. There's my morality. I just take all these things from the salad bar. Whoop, that's enough. And I just want to get on with my entertainments and the rest of my life. Why spend any time actually reading Marx, or actually reading Martin Luther King Jr., or actually reading Derrida or Foucault? Why spend any time doing any of that work when there's so much Netflix to watch? This is how we live. So people mix it up at the salad bar, and the writer figures out that you gain status by being in one of these categories, and then you have the victim Olympics. And I was talking to my daughters about some of the crazy things that happen on Tumblr, how people square off because they're all shipping two members on Voltron, and so but maybe by the script these two people are related, so I'm against. It's just insane what's going on in the world. And so then you have the victim Olympics, and then you have this great video by South Park, plain old white no more, just a standard white guy, and they're all getting tested by 23andMe and discovering they've got some African or Native American blood. Woohoo! Now they're an oppressed minority. So back to the elites, back to our university religious indoctrination. Working stiffs are just pursuing their animalistic programs trying to survive. That's why we're eating from the low-resolution salad bar buffet of world ideas, and why, capitalism seems mean. Let's be Marxist, without having really any idea what capitalism and Marxist is. Well, now I'm an intellectual elite because I recommend that they read books. Most Americans don't read books. This is part of the reason I started making YouTubes, because I was thinking about book writing, and I thought, I could write a book. Nobody will read it. So might as well make some YouTubes. It's a little bit easier. And it's a way of me thinking out my things. Having options is almost the definition of being your own sovereign. And this is key, something I've noted in American life. Sometimes people will come up to me and they've got cancer and things are horrible and they've got treatment A or treatment B. Well, at least I have options. And I'm thinking, yeah, they're both lousy. They're both, and so often it's just how we feel. Well, if I have choice in the matter, and this gets into some of Jordan Peterson's stuff about things that are voluntarily chosen, we feel, in Peterson's words, I have no way to I have no way to evaluate this. This engages the predator circuits, not the prey circuits. And I'm low resolution on psychology. Seems to make sense to me. So having options is almost the definition of being your own sovereign. So try the Sex and the City lifestyle. So burn through your 20s in that. Well, if you find it unfulfilling, become an activist, or date a member of the same sex, or go paleo by trying monogamy or spirituality. But be not limited by your history or your biography. This is the religion of the day. Now, Peterson has limited eschatology, as the quick to listen podcast from Christianity Today has pointed out. He struggles with telos. And basically his argument, if you listen to his lectures, are things got pretty good right now. The lights are on. We're all behaved in the university classroom. Yeah, you're not getting humanities as you want. I'm going to maybe try and start a humanities program that can fix that, because what happened in the secularization of the universities is that the humanities displaced theology. So we're now going to do theology via humanities, which is exactly what we're doing here. But the lights stay on and freedoms are quite broadly distributed. Things have never been better. He's kind of like Steven Pinker in that, okay? And he says, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm just trying to help people. But the critics then jump on him and say, yeah, things are pretty good for you, Jordan Peterson. You're going to make millions of dollars this year via your Patreon and your book sales. And I don't know if he's going to make millions of dollars. I asked someone who knows a little something. He said, yeah, he'll probably make millions of dollars between his book sales and his Patreon and his tour and all of that. He is set for life now in terms of money, and he's got his pension and he lives in Canada. So yeah, it's good to be Jordan Peterson. And so critics look at him and said, hey, you've had your turn at the trough. What about the black folks? And what about the women? And what about everyone else? You're just trying to close the barn door before we all can get in. How nice of you, a white man at the top of your career to declare, we've arrived, when I think progress hasn't concluded and we've not reached the eschaton. Why? Because people still suffer, and because black youth are still gunned down, and because women don't make as much money as men, and because healthcare isn't as available in the United States as it should be. And we haven't even started talking about the rest of the world. So Peterson, why are you opposing progress? And this is exactly what we saw in the Monk debate. Stop progress. This is good enough. This, in a sense, seems to be what Peterson's saying. Critics see Peterson through collectivist lens as a successful white male who has arrived at the good life and now wants to shut the door so that newcomers won't threaten his status. He is, in a sense, now he's the elite Puritan. Only he's not preaching libertinism. If he were preaching libertinism, everyone would be happy. But he's living Puritan, preaching Puritan. So he's breaking the script. We want our liberals being Puritans, but preaching libertine. The only problem is when people believe what the libertine preachers say, it's a disaster in their lives. And this comes back to Peterson's point about evolution and elephant paths. This is why we get the ongoing association with Trumpism, which is pretty amazing, because Trump lives libertinism and preaches Puritanism. This is true. So that's why he's on top of the Republican heap. You can live libertinism and get away. He should, well, for most of his life, he was a Democrat. It makes perfect sense. He lived libertine and he preached libertine. Now he lives libertine and he preaches Puritan. Well, keep out the women, the ethnic minorities, the immigrants who want a seat at the table. Ronald Reagan had the wall doors open so that the world could stream in. And on immigration, some Republicans will knock Reagan's amnesty. You have the narratives of the civil rights movement giving us the morality we're all hungering for. Jordan Peterson is a mean, angry white man. He's a cautious man battling, demanding utopias. That's what he is. And this is, in fact, what we saw on the Monk debate. This is a theological battle. No God, no heaven too demands utopia now. Listen to John Lennon's song. We can have it all now. Well, really? Religion is the opiate of the masses. Heaven and hell then get pulled into this frame, if you exclude the age to come or the next world. And that's something that I don't know that the materialists have fully owned up to. That what tends to happen, and I think you could make this argument from a Petersonian sense, what tends to happen if you lose an afterlife, heaven and hell get pulled into this life. And so in a sense, Peterson says heaven and hell are both already in this life, but you bring hell in when you close heaven's door, because now you need to execute justice in this life, which is exactly what Miroslav Volf was saying in Exclusion and Embrace, based on his experience in the decaying Yugoslavia. Jordan Peterson's lack of eschatology doesn't help his case, because Christians blunt suffering with the hope of resurrection that materialism keeps mocking. And so this is part of the reason we see all of this ongoing debate between Peterson and the resurrection, because in a sense, Peterson's Puritan conservative ethos and his Puritan preaching is because, well, what he doesn't have is the standard next step, which is heaven and hell, where justice gets meted out. And now, okay, let's say you're a skeptic on these matters. They still make sense in terms of story. They still make sense in terms of community. They still make sense in terms of Peterson's quote-unquote God, who, whether or not Peterson can talk about his ontology, is still functional in the system. And what I don't think Peterson has fully come to terms with is that if you don't buy the whole package, you lose the power of the package. And I think this is what the religious people are instinctively, including myself, instinctively saying to Peterson, which is, you're probably not going to be able to work the game fully without buying the full package, even within this frame. Does the belief in the next world make this one better? I think Jesus says yes. And I think Jesus is right. Well, I'm a Christian minister. If I didn't think he was right, I'd want to get out of my profession, which I have zero interest of getting out of. Jesus says, serve your neighbor and love your enemy. Well, what does serving your neighbor and love your enemy get? Does it get you wealth and power and riches and all the things this world gives? No, because often if you serve your neighbor or love your enemy, you just lose money. But pay attention to Nicholas Kristof. Now, Nicholas Kristof is a liberal opinion writer for the liberal New York Times. And over the last few years, what he's done is write a series of columns on African doctors. And because he went over to Africa and he realized, now, Africa doesn't have developed states. And in fact, in many places in the world, states are a problem. And this is part of Peterson's argument. Peterson is saying, in the West, we've done pretty good at states, at governments. Most of human history, most of the world have done a terrible job at governments. And if you want to look at an entire continent full of underperforming and poor governments, look at Africa, okay? Well, what is the medical system for Africa? Well, if you're someone who's grown wealthy in Nigeria on oil money, well, then you can fly to Europe or fly to the United States and have your kids educated in the United States and Europe. But if you're a poor African, where do you go for medical care? You go to Christians. Well, where have these Christian doctors been educated? In North America. Well, why would you go to American University, go through all the expense of medical school, and then go overseas full-time, not a little feel good about myself junket, but full-time, and devote your entire life to handing out what you could make a very comfortable living at in North America and Europe, or even in these other countries serving the elite? Why would you spend your life helping poor people? It makes no sense. It makes Jesus sense. That's what Jesus does. Well, what are these doctors anticipating? A crown and glory. Oh, it's the opiate of the masses. Oh, that we have to put this away. We have to get rid of this. Let's be a celebrity atheist and make sure nobody believes this. All right. Do you want to get rid of health care for Africans? Is that your goal? By getting rid of religion? Because that's one of the things religion is doing. Is religion doing bad things? Sure. But it's also doing health care in Africa. And Nicholas Kristof, he does a conversation with Tim Keller. You can find that video online. Because of all of Kristof's heights of the ascendant morality in the American system, one of the things he can't get his mind around are these Christian African missionaries who are spending their life serving Africans. And in fact, they live within a long history. If you read the Poisonwood Bible, you've only got half the story. So, well, who would you rather have? Does it make sense? Does belief in the next world make this world a better one? If you read Nicholas Kristof, it does. Now you have to ask yourself a question. Who do you want to see more of? The Sex and the City columnist who's just burning through all the available ways of trying to find authenticity and morality and truth? Where there's deep skepticism about moral knowledge? Or do you look for people who believe they have moral knowledge and are banking their life on moral knowledge and spending their life serving the poorest of the poor? Well, which idea do you think should be promoted? Figure that out.